All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to jump straight into a topic you, our listeners, have been
Yeah.
requesting. Emergency procedures for glider pilots. We got a ton of documents from you all, really interesting stuff. We've been digging through it, pulling out some really critical information you need to know.
Definitely a unique environment, gliding. Think about it. No engine, relying on those thermals and updrafts. It requires, well, a different kind of awareness, a different kind of preparedness. So we're diving deep into that, the unexpected stuff, control problems, instruments going haywire, equipment malfunctions, and of course that always present possibility, landing off airport. How do pilots handle those moments, those make or break decisions? That's what we're here to explore from the second you launch to, well, every possible scenario in the air.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, the aero tow. It's essentially that initial connection to the
Yeah.
sky, right? But even when you're still linked to the tow plane, things can go wrong. Both pilots, tow pilot and glider pilot, share a huge responsibility when it comes to safety. And sometimes, tough as it is, the glider pilot has to make the call to release that tow rope if their position is actually putting the tow plane at risk.
Absolutely. What's fascinating is that sometimes it's not even a mechanical failure or pilot error right off the bat. It's the environment. Like picture flying into a cloud bank out of nowhere, visual contact gone, or encountering those, what are they called, mountain rotors, vicious turbulence downwind of mountains, or just suddenly visibility drops. Any of those could be a good reason to release.
Right, right. And then, of course, there's pilot error, both sides. And the documents give some really specific examples. For the tow pilot, taking off too early before the glider's ready, making steep turns without pre-agreeing with the glider pilot, or, and this was almost irresponsible, misusing those signals, like sending the release now signal when there's no actual emergency.
Yeah, that's playing with fire. And for the glider pilot, mistakes could be letting the glider get out of position during the tow. Happens more easily than you'd think. Or losing sight of the tow plane, that visual connection is vital. And even something that seems minor, forgetting to completely close and lock those air brakes before takeoff, that drag makes it so much harder for the tow plane to climb.
Now, one term that really popped out from the documents was kiting. Sounds more like something you do on a windy day, not with, well, aircraft. But this is where it gets interesting, right? If the glider gets too high, way above and behind the tow plane, it can create a really hairy situation.
It does, because that tow line tension can actually start lifting the tow plane's tail. And if that happens, the tow pilot might not have enough control to keep the plane flying straight. Plus, the glider that high creates so much drag, slows the tow plane down. And, the documents say it can take, get this, like 1,500 feet or more for the tow plane to recover if the rope breaks or the glider releases from that kited position. That's a lot. It shows you the forces we're dealing with here.
And then there's a possibility of those spoilers deploying when you don't want them to during takeoff. If you haven't properly locked them down, the airflow as you gain speed can force them open, either on the ground or right after liftoff.
And here's the thing, even if the glider pilot doesn't notice those spoilers have popped open, that extra drag can be a huge problem for the tow plane, especially if there's anything like trees or power lines at the end of the runway. If they have to release in that situation, the glider's low and slow, making a safe landing really tricky if the pilot doesn't react instantly.
This is where good communication between the pilots becomes absolutely crucial. The tow pilot might waggle their rudder, that side-side movement of the tail, to signal that something's off with the glider. It's so important the sources emphasize this, not to mistake that waggle for the wing rock, which means release immediately. Confusing those two puts the glider pilot in a really bad spot. Low altitude, spoilers out, needing to get down fast.
Huge difference. The rudder waggle is just, hey, check your instruments, check your controls. The wing rock is a direct order, release right now. But hopefully, if there's enough time, the tow pilot can get on the radio and tell the glider pilot directly about those open spoilers.
Okay, we've covered pilot actions, we've talked about environmental factors, but then there are those mechanical failures that can happen during an aero tow. Adds another layer of complexity.
For sure. You could have a failure of the tow hook itself, on either the glider or the tow plane. Problems with the tow plane's engine, or issues with the airframe of either aircraft. And in any of those cases, the tow pilot's signal to release, again, that wing rock. But remember, the glider pilot can always release at any time if they think it's safer, like if something feels wrong with the controls as the airspeed builds on takeoff.
And what happens if the glider pilot tries to release but the mechanism fails? That's a real nightmare scenario.
Yeah, that's when you need those specific signals. If you pull the release and nothing happens, you signal the tow pilot, move the glider to the left side of the tow plane's slipstream, fly a bit offset, and then rock your wings. Then, the procedure is for the glider to stay a bit higher than usual in the tow, while the tow pilot brings them back over the airport, or glider port, and then the tow pilot will activate their release. Hopefully, the line detaches cleanly from both aircraft at that point. And get this, some glider tow hooks might need a manual release by the pilot even after the tow plane disconnects. An extra layer of safety, I guess.
So there are backup procedures, thankfully. But what if both releases fail? That's got to be incredibly rare but terrifying.
Exceptionally rare, but there are procedures for that too. One option, if the situation allows, is for both aircraft to land together while still connected. The glider pilot would stay low in the tow using spoilers to avoid getting too close to the tow plane. And the tow pilot, well, they'd have to make a really shallow approach landing after the glider. But there's a risk there. If the glider pilot brakes too hard, it could slow them both down too much, and the tow plane could end up in a really rough landing.
That sounds so delicate. What's the alternative if both releases are stuck?
The other option is something called the slackline procedure. The glider pilot basically tries to intentionally break the tow line, hopefully while they're still within gliding range of a field. But here's the thing. This is a high-risk maneuver because that tow line could get tangled up in the aircraft. In the wings, the tail, the propeller, even cause damage if it doesn't break cleanly at that weak link they build in. The technique involves the glider pilot flying a little higher than the tow plane to create some slack in the line. Then, they dive sharply, increase airspeed, and at the same time, deploy full spoilers. That sudden change, the tow plane speeding up and the glider slowing down, puts a huge amount of stress on the line, and the hope is it snaps at the weak link. If the pilot can't confirm it broke there, they have to land as if the tow line was still attached, following those very specific procedures. A true last resort.
Right. Not something you want to do unless it's absolutely necessary. Let's shift gears a bit. What happens when the tow line actually fails? It breaks unexpectedly, or you get the signal to release because the tow plane has a problem. The documents lay out different procedures based on exactly when this happens.
Makes sense. If it happens before the tow plane even lifts off and they abort takeoff, the tow pilot's procedure is to steer left. The glider pilot, seeing that, releases and maneuvers right, clearing the tow plane. Now, if the glider is already in the air, even just a little bit, when the tow fails and the tow plane's still on the ground, the glider pilot should release and land straight ahead, maybe steering a bit right after touchdown to stay clear. Important thing to remember is, those procedures can vary from airport to airport. Pilots have to know the local protocols at their airfield.
So what about those situations after takeoff, where you haven't gained much altitude, and there's not enough runway left to land straight ahead? You don't have enough altitude to safely turn back, specifically below 200 feet AGL.
That's a critical situation, very low altitude. And in almost every case, landing straight ahead is the safest option. Trying to do a 180-degree turn that low is incredibly risky. You just don't have the performance at those speeds. And the chance of stalling or hitting a wingtip on the ground is huge. The advice is clear. Find the best spot you can right in front of you, get that speed down to minimum just before touchdown, and be ready for an off-field landing. A slower impact means a much lower chance of serious injury or damage to the glider.
Makes sense. A controlled landing straight ahead, even if it's not ideal, is much better than risking a low-altitude stall trying to get back to the runway. Now, above that 200-foot mark, things change a bit, right? Landing downwind on the departure runway becomes a possibility.
It does, yeah. If you have enough altitude for a 180-degree turn and you're within gliding distance, landing back on the runway is something to consider. But the documents are clear. 200 feet AGL is that crucial minimum to even think about it. And you've got to factor in the wind, especially any headwind, because that will affect how far you can actually glide at that altitude. You might reach 200 feet a lot sooner than you think. In those cases, landing ahead on the remaining runway might be the better choice.
And there's also the situation where the tow failure is because of an emergency with the tow plane itself.
Absolutely. If that's the case, the glider pilot's priority is getting clear of the tow plane's path. The tow pilot might need to make some drastic maneuvers to maintain control or get down quickly.
So let's say the pilot does decide to try that 180-degree turn for a downwind landing. What are the crucial things they need to focus on throughout the maneuver?
Airspeed, airspeed, airspeed. You've got to maintain that safe flying speed. Your instinct might be to pull back on the stick, but that can be dangerous. If the tow rope's broken or you've already released, get rid of any part of it still attached to the glider. No entanglement. During the turn itself, aim for about a 45-degree bank. That gives you a good margin above stall speed, manages your altitude loss, and lets you reverse course quickly enough. And the whole time, smooth, coordinated control inputs are essential. Ailerons, rudder, elevator working together to maximize your glide and hit that approach speed you need for a downwind landing.
Landing downwind is a totally different experience than landing into the wind, right?
Completely. You've got that wind pushing you, so your ground speed is much higher the whole way down. Your descent looks shallower than you're used to, so you might need to use those spoilers a bit more, a bit earlier, to control your descent. That higher ground speed will be obvious during the flare, that moment just before touchdown, and even after you've touched down. You'll be relying on your spoilers and that wheel brake a lot more to slow down and stay in control on the ground. And yeah, that rollout distance, it's going to be longer when you're landing with a tailwind.
Now, what if that tow failure happens higher up, say above 800 feet AGL? You've got a lot more options then.
You do. At 800 feet or higher, you have more time to think clearly, assess the situation, and consider different landing spots. Depending on the airport, you might be able to land on a crosswind runway or land into the wind on the runway you took off from, maybe even a taxiway if it's long enough and clear. And in some cases, especially if the main runway's blocked or just not a good option, landing off airport in a carefully chosen field could be the safest choice.
And if the failure happens really high up, above normal traffic pattern altitude, what's the protocol then?
First thing, get clear of the tow plane. Safety first. If the tow line's still attached, release it. Get rid of it. Then, turn back towards the airport while you assess your situation. How's the glider? What's the wind doing? How much altitude do you have? Then you decide, do you try to find some lift and stay airborne, or do you head back to the airport and land? Important to remember, there are regulations about dropping things, like that tow line, from the air. You have to make sure it's not going to cause any harm on the ground.
All right, let's talk about something that honestly doesn't sound too great, slackline. The name itself suggests a loss of tension, a loss of control in the tow system.
And that's pretty much it. Slackline means the tow line goes loose, either partially or completely, during the tow. And if it's severe or lasts too long, it can be very dangerous. The line could get tangled in the aircraft, or it could cause structural damage when it suddenly goes taut again. The documents list a bunch of things that can cause slackline. The tow plane suddenly reducing power, descents during the tow, the glider making turns that are too tight, updrafts and downdrafts, those sudden recoveries from wake turbulence, even the glider diving too much towards the tow plane.
Updrafts causing slackline. That's a bit counterintuitive. How does rising air lead to a loose tow line?
It's all about the relative movements of the two aircraft. If the tow plane hits an updraft first, it'll seem like it's climbing fast from the glider pilot's perspective. Then, when the glider enters that same updraft, it might actually climb even faster than the tow plane, and the pilot might instinctively push the nose down to get back to their normal tow position, but that can cause the glider to speed up, potentially faster than the tow plane, and that's when you get slack in the line.
So if a pilot finds themselves in a slackline situation, what should they do to recover?
The key is to act fast, the second you feel any slack. First, increase your drag. You can try a gentle side slip, using rudder and aileron to move the glider sideways and get back in line behind the tow plane. Often, that'll take up the slack. If that's not enough, carefully deploy those spoilers a little at a time. That'll slow you down, let the tow plane catch up, and tighten that line. And once the line is taut, you have to reduce that drag again. Retract those spoilers, stop the side slip, and get back into that stable position behind the tow plane. The most important thing, though, is if the slack gets too bad. If you can't control it, or if anything feels unsafe, release immediately. A clean release is almost always better than a risky tow.
What are some of the mistakes pilots make when dealing with a slackline?
The documents highlight a few common errors. One is simply waiting too long to react, hoping the slack will just go away on its own. But that can make it much harder to manage. Another mistake is overcorrecting, using those controls too abruptly or aggressively. That puts a lot of strain on everything. And the last one is forgetting to reduce that drag once the line is taut again. Flying with those spoilers out when you don't need them impacts the performance of both aircraft.
Okay, we've covered a lot about aero tow. Let's move on to ground launches. Different dynamics there, right? The glider's pulled by a winch or a vehicle on the ground. What are some of those abnormal situations you might encounter during a ground launch?
With a ground launch, that tow speed and the tension in the line can be more unpredictable, controlled by the launch operator who's often far away. If it's too fast, you could damage the glider or have trouble controlling it. Too slow, you might not even get off the ground, or you could stall right after liftoff. That's why radio communication and those visual signals are essential. If anything feels off during the launch, maybe unusual vibrations, a change in the line's tension, or the acceleration is weird, release the tow line and be ready to land straight ahead on whatever's left of the launch area.
And there's the chance of the launch mechanism itself malfunctioning.
Yeah. The main sign of that would be a gradual loss of climb rate or airspeed, even though the winch or tow vehicle is still going. If you see that happening, release the tow line and land. But, and this is important, it could be easy to confuse that with the spoilers opening unintentionally. So if you notice that sudden performance drop, double-check that spoiler handle, make sure it's locked, and those spoilers are fully retracted.
The documents also mention wind gradient. What's that, and how could it affect a ground launch?
Wind gradient is when the wind speed increases significantly the higher you go. So imagine you're launching on a day with gusty winds. As you lift off, you hit that stronger wind, and your airspeed jumps up quickly. And if it gets too high, you could exceed the safe tow speed, which is bad news. If that happens, the right move is to gently push the stick forward. That'll reduce the tension on the tow line, bring your speed back down. And at the same time, you've got to signal the launch operator either on the radio or with those visual signals and ask them to slow down. If you're being launched by a winch with automatic tension control, you'll mainly use pitch changes to manage your airspeed, and you'll climb faster if the wind increases aloft.
Okay, let's get into those emergency procedures specific to ground launches.
Well, a broken tow line is the big one, a real emergency. You have to react instantly. The first thing is to release that broken line and immediately push the nose down, get that airspeed up, and keep it there. Remember, ground launches often start with the nose pretty high. You don't have much altitude to play with, so if you don't lower the nose quickly after a tow line break, you could stall right there, close to the ground.
And the procedure changes slightly depending on exactly when during the launch that tow line breaks, right?
That's right. If it breaks early, even before you're fully off the ground or at speed, you just land straight ahead. The tow vehicle operator will do their best to get out of the way. If you're already airborne even a little bit, when the line breaks, it's the same thing. Lower the nose, maintain airspeed, land straight ahead. Oh, and something to be aware of. Some launch systems use a small parachute on the tow line to help recover it. Make sure you're aware of that parachute's position so it doesn't get tangled up in the tail or control surfaces during a tow line break or even a normal release.
What happens if it's your tow release mechanism that fails?
If your release doesn't work, you've got to keep flying, at or above your best LD speed, over and past the launch equipment. That could either trip the tow hook's backup release or cause the weak link in the line to break. Plus, the launch equipment itself should have its own emergency release. Winches usually have something that can cut the line, and vehicles should have a secondary release too.
We focused a lot on the launch phases. Let's talk about what can go wrong once you're in sustained flight. And the section on self-launch takeoff emergencies really emphasizes the need for pre-flight planning. What are some key things those pilots need to consider before even starting their takeoff roll?
For self-launching gliders, good pre-takeoff planning is crucial. They have to know their aircraft's performance inside and out. Takeoff distances, climb rates, glide ratios, all of it. They need to have those normal and emergency procedures from the POH or GFM memorized. A lack of knowledge about the aircraft systems can turn into a dangerous situation really quickly. Like, imagine leaving those spoilers open during takeoff. You're not going to climb, and you could be in real trouble. Other things to think about are in-flight fires, structural issues, sudden turbulence or wind shear, canopy failures, and especially accidentally flying into IMC, losing visual contact with the ground.
And how a pilot responds to those emergencies, it all depends on a bunch of factors, right?
Exactly. Altitude, wind conditions, weather all play a role. So part of that pre-takeoff planning should involve things like checking how density altitude might affect takeoff performance, looking at the runway length, identifying potential emergency landing areas, and being aware of any traffic patterns or airspace restrictions. Those emergency options might include landing on the remaining runway, making a forced landing off airport, or if you have enough altitude, trying to make a controlled return. The important thing is to know those emergency procedures for your specific glider. They're in the POH or GFM, study them.
Let's talk about some in-flight emergencies, not necessarily tied to the launch phase. Spiral dives and spins, they both sound really disorienting and potentially deadly if you don't handle them correctly.
They can be, for sure. A spiral dive, that's when you enter a steep nose-down turn and don't correct it quickly enough. Your airspeed builds rapidly, altitude drops, and the danger there is the natural instinct to just yank back on the stick. But that can put so much stress on the glider, you could exceed those structural limits and it's game over. The right way to recover is to first reduce that bank angle, get those wings closer to level. Only then do you gently pull back on the stick to raise the nose. A lot of mistakes happen because pilots don't realize they're in a spiral dive. They might mistake it for a spin, or they panic and use the controls the wrong way or in the wrong order. Smooth and coordinated is key.
And spins, those downward corkscrew paths. How does a glider end up in one of those?
A spin is essentially a stall taken to the extreme. You exceed that critical angle of attack on one or both wings, the lift disappears, and the glider starts rotating, yawing around its vertical axis. It can happen so fast that the pilot doesn't even realize they've stalled until the glider suddenly yaws. Most modern gliders are designed to resist spinning. You have to really force them into it. But it can happen accidentally, especially at low speeds during stall recovery or if you're just flying too slow. That's why practicing stall recognition and recovery is so important.
So you find yourself in a spin. What do you do?
There are 4 phases to a spin: entry, incipient, developed, and recovery. To recover from a developed spin, assuming there aren't specific instructions in your glider's POH or GFM, you do this. Neutralize the ailerons, full opposite rudder, push the pedal on the side opposite the spin direction, hold it there until the rotation stops. Neutralize the rudder, and then immediately push the stick forward past neutral. This forward stick is crucial. It breaks the stall. Be decisive with it. Once the rotation stops and the airspeed starts coming back up, you can gently pull back on the stick to level off. But be careful not to pull back too hard or too soon. You could restall and end up back in the spin.
Sounds like there are a lot of things that can go wrong during spin recovery.
There are. First off, make sure the area below you is clear before you even think about practicing spins. Then, make sure you're in the right configuration. No flaps, no spoilers, the right airspeed. You need to get into a fully developed stall. Any wrong or mistimed control inputs will delay or stop your recovery. And it's easy to get disoriented in a spin. You might not be able to tell which way you're spinning or where the ground is. Confusing a spin with a spiral dive is really dangerous because the recoveries are opposite. And that urge to pull back on the stick too soon, that can cause a secondary stall, putting you right back in the spin. And of course, you've got to recover before you run out of altitude.
Now let's talk about off-field landings. The documents say this can happen for all sorts of reasons.
Definitely. Sudden bad weather, wind changes, hitting a big area of sinking air, getting lost, tow failure. It can all force you to land somewhere that's not an airport. And sometimes, if you know you can't make it back to the airfield, a well-planned off-field landing is actually safer than desperately trying to stretch that glide when you know you don't have the altitude. Continuing that return when you know you're too low is incredibly risky.
So what are the most important things to do to make a successful and safe off-field landing?
It comes down to a few key actions. Be aware of the wind and any obstacles in the area. Find a good landing area, a flat, open field that's long enough for you to land and roll out safely. Plan your approach carefully, factoring in the wind direction, obstacles, and terrain. Execute that landing, stay in control the whole way down. And once you're down, contact your ground crew or emergency services.
The documents mention denial as something that can mess up a pilot's off-field landing planning.
It's a psychological thing. When you're facing a possible off-field landing, it can be tempting to keep searching for lift, hoping you can make it back. But that can be dangerous because you're losing precious time and altitude. Accepting the situation and planning that off-field landing early is so important.
Once you accept it, how do you go about picking a field and planning your approach?
When you still have some altitude, flying downwind first can help you scan a wider area and spot potential fields. Once you've got a few candidates, knowing the wind direction at ground level is critical. You want to land into the wind, it'll slow you down and shorten your rollout. While you're circling and checking out those fields, think about how the wind might be flowing over the terrain, hills, trees, buildings. Watch out for any signs of turbulence, especially on the downwind side of obstacles. The documents suggest using decision heights. By 2,000 feet AGL, you should have a general area in mind. By 1,500, a specific field, and at 1,000, you're committed. No turning back. Safety is the most important thing, even if that means landing in a field that might be tricky to retrieve the glider from. And when you're planning your approach, since you probably won't know the exact elevation of the field, judge your descent angle visually. Make adjustments as needed to compensate for any tailwind you might have because of the terrain.
What about clearing obstacles? That's got to be a major concern.
You have to make absolutely sure you clear everything. Trees, buildings, power lines, fences. Especially power lines, they can be really hard to see until you're practically on top of them. The towers might be visible, but those wires are almost invisible sometimes. The safest thing is to assume there are wires between any poles, structures, and buildings, even if you can't see them. Give yourself a good safety margin.
What makes a good, relatively safe off-field landing spot?
You want a field that's long and as flat as possible. Any slope you see from the air will be much steeper up close, and it can affect your landing roll. Sometimes the color of the ground can give you a clue. Drier, higher ground is often lighter in color, while lower areas where water collects are darker. If you have to land on a slope, try to land uphill. And be careful of fields with tall crops. They can hide all sorts of obstacles. A field with low, even vegetation is always better. Pay attention to any sudden changes in the height of the crops. That often means there's something hidden there, like a fence or ditch.
The documents recommend a specific approach procedure for off-field landings.
Yeah, it gives you a good look at the field from different angles. You start with a crosswind leg, downwind of the field, then fly upwind, parallel to your landing direction. Then another crosswind leg, upwind, which sets you up for a normal downwind, base, and final approach. This lets you see the field from all sides, so you're less likely to miss any hidden dangers. And during each leg, you're constantly assessing the field, adjusting your plan as needed. Also, think about how obstacles in your approach path will affect your usable landing distance. If you have to clear something tall at the edge of the field, you'll still be pretty high up as you fly over the first part of the field.
What about the landing itself? Any special techniques?
During the flare, try to hold the glider off the ground as long as you safely can. That lets your speed bleed off, and you'll touch down slower, shortening your rollout. Once you're on the ground, get on those brakes, use them progressively to slow down and stay in control. Be ready for any bumps or obstacles, and use the rudder to keep it straight.
So you're down safely. What's next?
First, check for injuries to yourself and any passengers. Then, secure the glider so it doesn't roll away or get damaged by the wind. And then, contact your ground crew or emergency services. Give them your location, especially if you have your GPS coordinates handy. It's a good idea to have those written down somewhere in case your GPS dies. If you can't reach your crew directly, try other glider pilots on the glider-to-glider frequency, or the tow pilot if you were on tow. Once you've made contact, you can start getting ready to de-rig the glider, but be prepared to wait. Depending on where you are, it could be a while. Stay with the glider unless you have a really good reason to leave, and make sure you're visible from the air.
What if there are injuries or another emergency?
If there are injuries or any other serious problem, take care of those injuries as best you can, then call for help. If you have cell service, call 911, give them your location, tell them what's happened, how many people are hurt. If you don't have cell service, use your glider's radio if it's working, and make a mayday call on 121.5 MHz. A lot of people monitor that frequency. And make sure your ELT is activated if you have one. Those PLBs that work with satellites and GPS can be lifesavers too. If the glider is in a dangerous spot, secure it if you can. If you're injured, it's usually best to stay with the glider. It's easier to spot from the air. Use it for shelter if you can, and save your energy. If you have to leave a note explaining where you're going and why.
All right, let's move on to malfunctions within the glider itself. Starting with flight instruments, those going wrong can be a huge challenge. What are some of the common causes of those failures?
Lots of things can cause instrument failures. Poor maintenance, problems within the instruments themselves, things blocking those pressure lines. Like an airspeed indicator could fail because the pitot or static line is kinked, disconnected, or blocked by bugs, water, or ice. It's so important to practice flying using just visual references, the horizon, the ground, so you're not completely dependent on instruments, especially important for landing. And remember, if one instrument is acting up, others might be affected too. Like a blocked static line will mess up both the altimeter and the airspeed indicator. So if you have any doubt about your instruments, don't trust them. And after landing, get them checked out by a qualified mechanic before you fly again.
What if your altimeter goes out during approach?
You'll have to rely on your eyes and judgment. Aim to start your approach a bit higher than usual. If it looks like you're going to overshoot, use those spoilers to get down faster. If you're going to land short, adjust your approach, make it shallower. A forward slip or a turning slip can also help you lose altitude without gaining speed.
How do you handle an airspeed indicator failure? That's a pretty critical instrument.
It is, but you can still fly safely without it. The key is to focus on the pitch attitude. There are specific attitudes for best glide and minimum sink. You'll need to pay attention to other cues too. How do the controls feel? What does the wind sound like? At slow speeds, those controls will feel sluggish and the wind will be quiet. As you speed up, the controls become more responsive and the wind gets louder. You can even open a vent or window to hear the wind better. In turbulent air, fly a bit faster than usual to make sure you have enough control. And if you're not sure about your speed, it's always safer to err on the side of flying a bit faster to stay above stall speed. But remember, flying too fast will increase your sink rate and reduce your range.
What if your variometer stops working? That's the instrument that tells you if you're in rising or sinking air.
Without a variometer,